Hello and welcome. This is a presentation of the League of Women Voters regarding the state ballot propositions on your November 3rd, 2020 ballot. I'm David Marin, a member of the League of Women Voters of Ventura County, and for expert analysis, we're joined today by Judge Melinda Johnson. Judge Johnson, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
What we're going to do in this program, which is number 4 of our ballot propositions, we're going to start off by talking about Proposition 17, 18, and then Proposition 20. Judge Johnson, let's get right to it. As far as Proposition 17, this deals with restoring the right to vote after prison. Can you explain a little bit about how this came about, and is there a burning issue here?
Well, there's a burning issue, I think, in voting rights in general, and there have been a lot of states, Florida most notably, who have been dealing with what to do with convicted felons and restoring the right to vote. In California, once you have served your entire term, your sentence, and your parole period, you can vote. You can register and vote. This would amend the Constitution to allow a convicted felon who has served his or her time actually in prison but is now out on parole, supervised prison, de facto constructive prison, to register to vote.
Well, with that, currently they are allowed to vote once they complete parole. That's the process?
Correct, when they're no longer under the supervision of the Department of Corrections in any way.
So what would be the disadvantage of, or what would be the argument against allowing people to vote as soon as they are released from prison, even if they're still on parole?
Most of the people who oppose this, it's completely understandable, but it's less a policy opposition than a personal opposition. They believe that when someone's been convicted of a felony, they've done harm to someone financially or personally, and that they should completely settle their entire debt to society before they should be restored to what they unfortunately call the privilege to vote. It's actually a right to vote, but before that's restored, like any other punishment, you pay the whole price first.
Well, that seems like an important argument. Sometimes people are released from jails because of overcrowding or from prison, so perhaps they should have to wait. But are there other rights that we take away from people when they're imprisoned, other than their freedom of movement?
Well, they can't do anything that requires them being personally present. So they're not able to go get a driver's license. They're not able to get employment. They're not able to access health insurance or anything else. They're isolated. That changes when they go on parole, which is intended to be a transition period from the penal portion of their sentence to their life as a regular member of the society.
And that seems like one of the supporters' arguments, that as soon as they're out in society again, by giving them the right to vote, that might promote them becoming more involved in society and less likely to recommit crimes.
That is the argument. There's an intense isolation involved with being in prison, and as you enter into society, the more you can be a part of it, the less likely you are to commit crime. And there is some clinical evidence to this effect. And honestly, if you are a parolee and you care enough to register to vote, it shows a good attitude towards your transition to civilian life.
And lastly, one of the things I found interesting, I did not realize that you cannot run for office until your right to vote is restored. So for somebody whose dream of getting out of prison and running for office, this would allow them to do that as soon as they were on parole.
I'm not sure that it's a lot of people's dreams, but it certainly becomes a lot of people's eventual success story, because they become sufficiently committed that they run for more or less local offices. Not if you've been convicted of robbery or perjury. We draw the line there.
Oh, we do.
You still can't run for office then.
Well, thank you. And so it seems this one is somewhat straightforward based on a person's own values. Our viewers can look at how they feel about the right of someone to regain their right to vote immediately when released from prison, or they may feel, as you put it, that, and victims have said, that they should pay the full measure of that crime before restoring the right. So thank you, Judge Johnson. Let's move on to Proposition 18. So this one is interesting in that I don't know if this has been an important issue over the years, but it gives young people the right to vote if they will be 18 on the day of the election or sooner of the general, but not in the primary. Can you tell us a little bit more about this one, please?
Well, we have always drawn arbitrary lines around a lot of social privileges and rights, the right to purchase alcohol, to purchase cigarettes, and the right to vote. And it's been done by and large on an analysis of the brain development and the social maturity of persons on average. We picked 18 as the right to vote. Not when I was 18. I had to wait till I was 21, even though I was absolutely ready when I was 18. But we picked these arbitrary times rather than any other criteria. So this again is like the one we just discussed. It's your feeling about how really ready 17-year-olds are to vote.
So the arguments in support are that these young people will be making an important decision in the general election. They should have a say in who the candidates are chosen in the primary. One of the arguments against it, though, is that sometimes in the primaries, the voters are selecting or voting on actual ballot propositions, maybe things that include taxes, and maybe 17-year-olds shouldn't be involved in those decisions. Are there other arguments for and against?
Well, I think both of the facts stated in the pro and con arguments are true. And it's just which sort of sets of facts apply to you. One of the pro arguments that's raised, it's very interesting, is that voting is a habit. There are people who never, ever miss an election. I suspect you're in that category. I know I'm in that category. And there are people who just kind of don't get around to it. When that habit is formed early, it creates good citizenship.
I see.
The con argument is, as you said, they may be quite immature to vote on things that are unrelated to who the candidates might be in the fall.
I think in some county-wide elections, you might have only two people running for, say, a supervisor or sheriff or treasurer, that actually 17-year-olds could be involved in making that final determination, since there would not be a runoff in the general for those kind of elections.
True.
So it's an interesting one, yes, more voters, but younger voters, and should we allow them to have that or not? So.
The argument that they always raise for a lot of things really is that they're old enough to join the military, they should be able to vote. So I've always thought, well, perhaps the test should be if you're 17 but emancipated. So if you actually are an active member of the military and you're emancipated, maybe that should be the test. There's a lot of ways to do it, but it's going to be arbitrary no matter what.
Okay, well, I certainly understand the point about getting them experienced with voting early. It seems that this came out of the legislature, though, and required votes by the legislature. It seems to be somewhat of a larger majority, so probably had some bipartisan support, but not completely.
Not much.
Not much. Okay. Well, thank you for that. Judge Johnson, let's go ahead and move on to Proposition 20. So this one is related to parole again, talks about sentencing. It's actually a little confusing to me in that there's multiple issues involved. So can you unpack this for us and explain what this issue does?
There is in California a one subject rule. Every initiative has to relate to a single subject. And it's because we have citizens who aren't privy to all the legislative hearings and so forth that goes into writing a complex statute. This comes very close to violating the one subject rule. It's all about criminal law. So I guess broadly speaking, it's one subject, but it's 4 separate topics in one initiative. And you may agree with some and disagree with others. And so it's a real balancing act for the individual. But the 4 topics are basically increased potential punishments for crimes of theft, the requirement that if someone is on parole being locally supervised, if that supervisor feels they've violated the terms after 3 times, they must ask the court to impose some custody time. More considerations are listed that must be specifically considered when someone has applied for parole or any kind of early release. And DNA will now be collected not just from people accused of felonies, but from people accused of a wide variety of misdemeanors, mostly theft-related and violence and some drugs.
So as far as, let's, I guess, start with the issue about what constitutes a felony versus a misdemeanor regarding theft. Mm-hmm. Currently, I believe it was Prop 47 was passed years ago that set a higher limit, so less people would be subject to felony prosecution. Now this lowers it to 250 in certain circumstances. What are those circumstances?
And it's interesting because it wasn't, when I first became a prosecutor, the difference between a felony and misdemeanor was $400. So we could be still talking about inflation here. But there are certain kinds of thefts, and if lower amounts of money are involved, the prosecutor has the choice to file it as a felony. And if he or she does, then the judge has the choice to sentence it as a felony or a misdemeanor, either one. And they involve what they call either serial thefts, people who have several convictions of petty theft of $250 a piece or more, or organized retail theft, which is more than one person banding together, committing a series of thefts over a period of time where the total amount stolen is $250. I'm sure that they are intending to go after real theft gangs, of which there are plenty around. This could sweep up a whole lot of other people. But that's why there's a option to treat it as a misdemeanor.
Well, when you ask about the other people, is that partly why this is even coming to the voters? I mean, it seems some ways the legislature has a job to do up in Sacramento. Shouldn't they look at some of these sentencing guidelines, or is this related to, because we passed Prop 47, we have to come back and pass Prop 20?
We don't have to pass it as a proposition. Prop 47 was just changing the statute. It didn't change the Constitution. Okay. The only time you have to come back to an initiative process is if an initiative changed the Constitution, which is the overarching law of the state. That can only be changed by a vote of the people. This is a statutory change, and it really does feel like something that would normally be done by the legislature.
Okay. So you mentioned the DNA. Now, will this be, so it's increasing the testing. What is the current law regarding DNA collection?
Mostly DNA is collected from people who have been arrested for felonies. And if they are eventually not convicted, it's either dismissed or they're found not guilty, they are supposed to expunge the DNA records. There's always some question whether that gets done, but that's what they're supposed to do. This would add people who are convicted, not just arrested, but convicted of several kinds of misdemeanors would have their DNA collected. And this is, the purpose of DNA collection is to solve unsolved major crimes where they have evidence they can't link up. I'm honestly not certain how someone who forged a check is likely to be a major candidate for a major serious violent felony arrest, but I'm not ruling it out. It seems a bit tenuous. It's a little tenuous is the connection.
I see. Does this also affect the way criminals are dealt with afterwards as far as parole, managing some of the parole decisions that come under this program?
The DNA would have no effect on that, but this initiative definitely speaks to that at some length. When someone applies for parole, for an early release, they go before a board. They have to make their case. I've learned my lesson. I deserve a chance, whatever the arguments might be. This sets forth very specific questions that must be asked, criteria that must be considered. They all sound like things, honestly, to me, that have always been considered. Maybe not every single one in every single case, but they feel like exactly the kinds of questions that might be asked. This also requires that the prosecutors make sure that the victims of the crimes for which the felon was convicted have notice and an opportunity to come to the hearing or to be heard in some fashion.
I believe some of the opponents of this feel that we need to reimagine policing, reimagine the criminal system as far as people that are at the lower end, let's say, of the socioeconomic ladder or different backgrounds, get harsher penalties, and that this would further criminalize them. And so somebody who maybe stole a bike, as wrong as that is, could end up in a federal prison or state prison, excuse me, over some of this. Where is that balancing act between, and I'm sure you don't have the exact answer, but your thoughts about the balancing act between some who feel they make one mistake and they get caught up and it ruins their life versus others that say we have to be strong on prosecuting criminals or we'll see things get out of hand.
This is the zero tolerance policing argument. It was in effect in New York for many years under Commissioner Bratton, who later came to Los Angeles. Prosecute the small crimes and the big crimes start going away. the evidence has been pretty universally clear that low-income persons, persons of color, tend to be caught up in this much more frequently, get much less informal handling than a typical upper middle class white person. This certainly has the potential of sweeping those people into it. As I mentioned, some people who are called serial thievers could be a couple of teenagers who go into a mall, on a couple of Saturdays and act idiotic like they tend to do, and could be subjecting themselves to really strenuous penalties.
So I guess for viewers, they'll be able to look at this. And we certainly remind all our viewers that the Secretary of State publishes the Voter Information Guide, which contains all of the ballot propositions, the full text of the law, and also the arguments for and against. So you'll want to research through that. But Judge Johnson, it seems to me that for the voter looking at this issue, it does come down to a sense of their values and priorities of whether they think we're overdoing it on the crime side. Maybe they want to not see this pass so that we continue to be relaxed in some regards, but others who feel things are a little out of control and maybe we need harsher penalties.
David, may I correct myself as well? Part of this initiative was in fact a constitutional amendment, not all of it, but part of it. And you do have to have a constitutional amendment to change that. So there may be some legal problems if this passes.
I say, well, that's back to the original point we started, but this is a combination of 4 different issues. And that certainly makes it challenging for me to try and sort it out and decide, do I like all 4, 3 of the 4? How do you do it? So Judge Johnson, thank you very much for your analysis on these propositions. We're going to end here, but the League has 3 other video presentations on the California ballot propositions with Judge Johnson and myself. Please make sure to vote in your election. Everybody should receive a mail-in ballot. Please, if you sign those ballots, make sure you sign your ballot and return them early. You can also drop them off at voting centers or vote in person as well. So for the League, I'm David Marin. Judge Johnson, thank you very much. And please see our other programs as well.